Welcome to Bantu Studio on YouTube. Subscribe to learn more African history and powerful stories of our leaders. This is Patrice Lumumba, the Voice of Congo, read by me, Mugisha. Narration, Chapter 1. The story of Patrice Emery Lumumba begins on July 2, 1925, in the small village of Onalua, in the Sankuru district of Kasai, in the heart of the Belgian Congo. He was born into a modest family of the Tetela people, one of the many ethnic groups that made up the vast Congolese population. His father, François Tolenga Otechima, and his mother, Julienne Wamato Lomendia, were not rich, not powerful, but hard-working people, raising their children under the shadow of a colonial system that ruled every corner of daily life. Congo was not an ordinary colony. It was a land of staggering richness in minerals, timber, and fertile soil. Yet its people were among the most exploited on earth. For decades, first under King Leopold II's personal rule, and then under the Belgian state after 1908, Congo was treated less as a nation and more as a vast business venture. Congo under Belgian rule. To understand Lumumba, one must first understand the Congo he was born into. Leopold II had claimed Congo at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, presenting it to Europe as a humanitarian project, a Congo-free state. In reality, it became one of the most brutal regimes of forced labor in history. Rubber quotas enforced by the whip, villages terrorized by soldiers, and the infamous practice of cutting off hands as proof of obedience. Historians estimate that millions of Congolese died in those decades. When international outrage finally forced Belgium to take control in 1908, things improved only in appearance. Belgium presented itself as a civilizing power, bringing railways, schools, and Christianity. But in truth, Congo remained a land where resources were extracted, not shared, and where Congolese were treated as cheap labor, not citizens. At the time of Lumumba's birth, the entire administrative system was built on racial hierarchy. Europeans lived in segregated neighborhoods with privileges, while Congolese lived in villages and quarters with no political rights. A small minority of Africans could climb into the category of evolus, the evolved, educated, French-speaking Africans who wore European clothes and were given minor privileges, but always reminded that they would never be equal to whites. It was into this world of contradiction, of missionary schools promising advancement, and of a colonial system enforcing subordination, that Patrice Lumumba grew up. Early education. As a boy, Lumumba showed an unusual eagerness to learn. He attended Protestant mission schools, where he excelled at reading, writing, and speaking French. Missionaries taught Bible lessons, arithmetic, and basic literacy, but the underlying goal was to create obedient workers and Christians who would serve colonial society. Children were discouraged from speaking their native languages, and African culture was dismissed as backward. Yet for Lumumba, the ability to read and write opened an entirely new world. He read not only his school books, but also borrowed anything he could find: newspapers, pamphlets, even fragments of European philosophy. The young Lumumba developed the qualities that would later define him: eloquence, a sharp memory, and a restless curiosity about the world. He wanted to rise beyond the limits that Belgium had set for Congolese men. Congo's contradictions. While Lumumba was mastering French verbs in school, The Congo around him revealed daily the injustices of colonial rule. Congolese workers labored in mines owned by Belgian companies like Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, producing copper, cobalt, diamonds, and uranium that enriched Europe while leaving locals in poverty. Forced labor was still common. Men were compelled to leave villages for months to work on roads, plantations, or railways. Families were separated, wages were meager, and resistance was often met with violence. In towns, Europeans enjoyed cinemas, clubs, and electricity, while Congolese were barred from white-only areas. The law itself was a system of discrimination, with separate courts for Africans and Europeans. For a young boy like Lumumba, these inequalities were not abstract. They were visible in the streets, in the fields, in every encounter where Congolese were forced to step aside for whites. Family and character. Despite the harsh environment, Lumumba's family gave him strength. His parents instilled discipline and respect. His natural charm and intelligence quickly made him stand out. Neighbors recalled him as a boy who was both serious and sociable, someone who liked to talk, to argue, and to lead. From childhood, he showed what we might call leadership instincts. He had a presence that drew others to him, a way of speaking that made people listen. These traits would one day make him one of the most charismatic orators in African history. A nation without citizens. By the time Lumumba was a teenager in the 1940s, the Belgian Congo had over 12 million people, but not a single Congolese citizen. Legally, Congolese were considered subjects, not citizens, of Belgium. The évolués, the small educated class, could apply for a certificate of civil merit, which granted limited privileges such as exemption from forced labor and permission to drink in European bars. But even they were always second class in the eyes of the state. The system of humiliation left deep scars, but it also created a generation of educated Africans who began to ask why they should remain second class in their own land. Patrice Lumumba was among them. Narration, Chapter 2. By the early 1940s, Patrice Lumumba had grown into a determined young man with ambition burning inside him. He had completed his mission school education and stood at a crossroads. For most Congolese, the future was limited. Work in the fields, on plantations, in mines, or as low-paid labor for the colonial state. But Lumumba wanted more, a career in the colonial service. In 1944, Lumumba found employment as a clerk in the postal service. This may sound ordinary, but in colonial Congo, it was prestigious. Postal clerks were among the tiny African elite trusted with handling official business, correspondence, and sometimes money. They wore neat uniforms and carried themselves with pride. For Lumumba, the post office was more than a job. It was a doorway. It gave him access to newspapers, letters, and ideas flowing across the colony. Each envelope, each telegram connected him to a larger world. He moved to Stanleyville, today Kisangani, where he became known as diligent, well-dressed, and articulate. He was no ordinary clerk. He had an aura of leadership, and colleagues noticed how he expressed himself with unusual confidence. The Evalu lifestyle. By now, Lumumba was recognized as an Evalu. He dressed in European suits, polished his shoes, and spoke refined French. He frequented social clubs where Evalus gathered to read, debate, and drink. But the Ivalu status was both empowering and humiliating. To earn the coveted Carte de Mérite Civique, the certificate of civic merit, an African had to prove to colonial authorities that he lived like a civilized man. This meant drinking moderately, avoiding immoral behavior, and imitating European manners. Even with the certificate, Ivalus were always reminded of their inferior position. They could not vote, they could not hold high office, they were praised as examples but never considered equals. Lumumba experienced this contradiction every day. He embodied the success of colonial education, yet he was still barred from the full dignity of citizenship, a passion for writing. During this period, Lumumba discovered his passion for writing. He contributed articles and letters to newspapers and journals, often signing with his name proudly. His style was elegant, almost literary. He wrote about freedom, dignity, and justice in carefully measured words. Unlike others who attacked colonialism directly and risked censorship, Lumumba used subtle language. He criticized injustice while still presenting himself as a loyal subject who wanted reform. This strategy allowed him to spread his ideas without being silenced immediately. His articles reached audiences across Congo, where readers recognized in him a voice that spoke their frustrations in clear French. Encounters with colonial racism. Despite his position and talents, Lumumba could not escape the daily realities of racism. White clerks earned more than African clerks. In public places, segregation rules applied. Europeans addressed Africans by their first names, never with titles of respect. Even Ivolus were often forced to bow to petty humiliations, showing papers on demand, stepping aside on sidewalks, or being barred from European-only establishments. Lumumba bristled at these injustices. He carried himself with dignity, refusing to appear submissive. Some Belgian officials described him as arrogant, but in truth it was not arrogance, it was pride. He believed he was the equal of any man, Belgian or Congolese, personal life and marriage. During these years, Lumumba also built his personal life. In 1951, he married Pauline Opango, a young woman from his region. Pauline would later stand by him through the turmoil of his political career, raising their children even as Lumumba faced prison and eventually death. Their marriage symbolized his grounding in Congolese society. While he was an Ivalu, speaking French and wearing suits, he remained connected to his people through family, tradition, and kinship. A first arrest. In 1956, Lumumba's growing prominence brought him trouble. He was accused of embezzling funds from the post office, charges that many historians believe were exaggerated, possibly fabricated, by colonial authorities threatened by his activism. He was arrested and spent a year in prison. For many, this would have been the end of a promising career. But for Lumumba, prison became a school of politics. Behind bars, he reflected deeply on the colonial system. He read more widely, including works on African nationalism, socialism, and global liberation struggles. He emerged more radicalized, more convinced that Congo's problem was not just bad administration, it was colonialism itself. The turning point, the 1950s. The 1950s were years of change across Africa. Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah achieved independence in 1957. Pan-African movements spread ideas of unity and liberation. In Congo, political discussion was still tightly controlled by Belgium, but pressure was mounting. In 1958, Lumumba attended the All-African People's Conference in Accra, Ghana, as a delegate. There he met African leaders and activists from across the continent. The atmosphere electrified him. For the first time, he stood shoulder to shoulder with men like Nkrumah, Tom Mboya, and Sekou Touré, who spoke of Africa rising against colonialism. Lumumba returned to Congo transformed. He no longer saw himself as just a writer or an evolue. He saw himself as part of a continental movement for freedom. Narration, Chapter 3. By the late 1950s, Patrice Lumumba had already lived several lives: a clerk, a writer, a husband, a prisoner. But now, history called him to a greater role, that of political leader, the political awakening of Congo. For decades, Belgium had claimed that Congo was not ready for independence. Unlike Britain and France, which were slowly allowing colonies some form of representation, Belgium kept Congo under tight paternalistic rule. But by the mid-1950s, cracks began to show. Across Africa, independence movements were succeeding: Ghana in 1957, Sudan and Morocco, Tunisia, and later Guinea. The winds of change could not be held back. In Congo, a new class of evolues, teachers, clerks, small traders, were organizing associations. These groups often started as cultural or regional clubs: Abako for the Bakongo people, associations for the Baluba, Bangala, and others. But underneath, they carried political energy. What was missing was a truly national movement, one that could speak not only for one tribe, but for the Congolese people as a whole. The birth of the MNC. In 1958, Patrice Lumumba and others helped found the Mouvement National Congolais, MNC. From the start, Lumumba's vision was clear: this would not be a tribal party, nor a regional one. It would be a movement that cut across ethnic lines, uniting the Congolese people under one banner of independence and dignity. This was a radical idea. Colonial authorities often encouraged divisions, using the classic strategy of divide and rule. Tribal chiefs were promoted, ethnic rivalries were inflamed, and political organizations were often kept local. But Lumumba believed Congo's survival depended on unity. With more than 200 ethnic groups, the country could easily fracture, and in fact, secessionist movements were already simmering in regions like Katanga and Kasai. The MNC declared that independence must come immediately and without conditions, and that Congo must be a single, united nation. Lumumba's leadership style. From the beginning, Lumumba's oratory skills set him apart. He could speak in French, Lingala, and Titela, adapting his style to his audience. In cities, he gave fiery speeches about sovereignty and dignity, using precise language that impressed intellectuals. In villages, he spoke in simple terms about the injustice of forced labor and the promise of freedom. People described how his eyes seemed to burn when he spoke, how his voice rose and fell like a drumbeat, and how crowds leaned forward, hanging on every word. To many Congolese, he embodied what they had long desired: a leader who spoke with courage, not fear, and who called them not just workers or tribesmen, but citizens of a nation to be. The Accra Conference. A turning point came in December 1958 when Lumumba traveled to Accra, Ghana for the All-African People's Conference hosted by Kwame Nkrumah. For Lumumba, this was his first time stepping onto a stage that was not only Congolese but African. In Accra, he met men like Nkrumah, Sekou Touré of Guinea, Tom Mboya of Kenya, and Frantz Fanon, the revolutionary thinker from Martinique. They debated strategies for liberation, peaceful negotiation versus armed struggle, gradual independence versus immediate freedom, African socialism versus liberal democracy. Lumumba listened, absorbed, and spoke. He declared that Congo's future could not be delayed. He called for African unity, saying that only together could the continent resist the pressures of neocolonialism. He returned to Congo transformed, more confident, more radical, more connected to Pan-African currents. He no longer thought of himself only as a Congolese leader. He saw himself as part of a generation tasked with freeing the whole continent. The rise of popular support. Back home, Lumumba threw himself into organizing rallies. The MNC gained momentum, drawing support from clerks, teachers, workers, and students. The colonial administration, alarmed, began to keep a close eye on him. They considered the MNC dangerous because it was not tied to one tribe. It was a direct challenge to Belgian control. Meanwhile, rival parties like ABACO, led by Joseph Kasavubu, focused on the interests of the Bakongo people and called for federalism rather than unity. Tensions between parties reflected Congo's fragile political balance. But among ordinary Congolese, Lumumba's popularity soared. He became known as the voice of the voiceless, the man who would not beg for independence politely, but demand it with fire. The 1959 Leopoldville riots. In January 1959, Congo's political crisis exploded. A rally organized by ABACO in Leopoldville, Kinshasa, turned into a massive protest. Belgian authorities tried to suppress it with force. Riots broke out, lasting several days. Dozens of Congolese were killed, hundreds were arrested. The riots shocked Belgium, revealing that the demand for independence could no longer be ignored. Although Lumumba was not directly involved in the riots, his movement benefited. The unrest proved his point. Congo was ready for independence, and delay would only bring violence. Lumumba's arrest and imprisonment. Later that year, Lumumba himself was arrested again, accused of inciting unrest. He was sentenced to prison. But once more, events conspired in his favor. Belgium announced that Congo would hold a round-table conference in Brussels in early 1960 to discuss independence. Congolese leaders demanded that Lumumba be released so he could attend. International pressure mounted. Finally, in January 1960, he was freed, just in time to play a decisive role in shaping Congo's future. Narration. Chapter 4. By the end of 1959, Congo was a country on the edge of transformation. The riots in Leopoldville had shocked Belgium. The rise of nationalist parties had shaken the colonial order. The prison walls that held Patrice Lumumba could not hold back the rising tide of independence. The Roundtable Conference in Brussels. In January 1960, Belgium invited Congolese leaders to Brussels for what became known as the Roundtable Conference. The goal was to negotiate Congo's future. Belgian officials expected the talks to drag on for years. They believed Congolese leaders would be divided by tribal and regional rivalries, and that Belgium could continue to control the pace of change. But something surprising happened. For once, Congolese leaders, Kasavubu of ABACO, Tushombe of Konakat, Kalonji of South Kasai, and many others, united around a single demand: independence now. Patrice Lumumba, released from prison just days earlier, arrived in Brussels with the force of a storm. He was welcomed as a hero by supporters and watched warily by Belgian politicians. Lumumba spoke firmly: Congo must be independent, not in 5 years, not in 10, but in 6 months. Belgium, realizing the depth of unity among Congolese parties and fearing more violence, had little choice but to agree. It was an extraordinary moment. A colony that Belgium had assumed would remain under its control for decades was now promised full sovereignty by June 30th, 1960. The struggle for power. But independence would not come without struggle. The Congolese leaders were not united in vision. Joseph Kasavubu and Abago favored a federal system where provinces would have autonomy. Moise Tshombe of Katanga, backed by Belgian mining interests, wanted even greater provincial independence, ensuring control over the mineral-rich south. Patrice Lumumba and the MNC demanded a unitary state, a strong central government that could keep Congo united. This disagreement would later explode into crisis. But in Brussels, the leaders managed to present a united front to the Belgians. The elections of May 1960, the agreement at Brussels called for national elections to form Congo's first government. In May 1960, millions of Congolese went to the polls. It was a chaotic process. Many Congolese had never voted before. Ballot papers were long, with dozens of parties, many based on ethnic or regional loyalties. Despite the confusion, one result was clear. The MNC, led by Patrice Lumumba, won the largest share of seats in parliament. It did not have an outright majority, but it emerged as the strongest national party. After weeks of negotiation, a compromise was reached. Joseph Kasavubu would become president, a mostly ceremonial role, while Patrice Lumumba would become prime minister, head of government, and the real power behind Congo's future. At only 34 years old, Lumumba stood at the head of a vast nation, a country the size of Western Europe, with more than 200 ethnic groups, immense resources, and immense challenges. The dream of independence. For Lumumba, the victory was not his alone. He believed it was the victory of the Congolese people. He traveled through towns and villages, greeted by cheering crowds, men and women who believed that the days of forced labor, humiliation, and silence were finally ending. His words captured the hope of millions. We will make the Congo a free nation, a dignified nation, respected in the eyes of the world. Our wealth will serve our people, not strangers. Our unity will be our strength. But beneath the celebrations lay danger. The Belgians were leaving in a rush, without building the institutions Congo needed. There were fewer than 20 Congolese university graduates in the entire country. Almost no Congolese held high positions in the army, civil service, or judiciary. Congo was stepping into independence full of hope, but also full of cracks that could easily break open. The countdown to 30 June. As June approached, preparations began for the grand ceremony of independence. Belgian King Baudouin would attend. Foreign dignitaries would arrive. For Belgium, it was meant to be a showcase, the end of colonial rule, but on Belgium's terms, with speeches of gratitude and friendship. For Lumumba, it was something else, the day when Congo would finally stand up straight after decades spent under foreign domination. Narration, Chapter 5. The day was June 30th, 1960. The city of Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, was alive with celebration. After more than 70 years of colonial rule, the Congo was about to become free. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags of green, yellow, and blue. Bands played drums and trumpets. Children sang songs of independence. There was joy in the air, but also tension, because this independence had come so quickly, with so little preparation, that no one knew what the future would bring. The ceremony. Inside the Parliament building, Belgian and Congolese leaders gathered for the official handover. At the front sat King Baudouin of Belgium, young and stiff in his uniform, representing a monarchy that had once claimed Congo as its personal property. Next to him were Belgian officials, diplomats, and business leaders, many of whom still hoped to control Congo's resources even after independence. On the Congolese side were President Joseph Kasavubu, quiet and formal, and Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, only 34 years old, carrying the weight of his people's hopes on his shoulders. The room was full of flowers, flags, and cameras. Across the world, newspapers and radios were waiting to broadcast the birth of a new nation, King Baudouin's speech. The ceremony began with King Baudouin's speech. He spoke proudly of Belgium's so-called civilizing mission. He praised King Leopold II, the very monarch whose rule had caused millions of deaths during the rubber atrocities. Baudouin described Leopold as a genius who had brought progress to Congo. He suggested that Congolese people owed gratitude to Belgium for the roads, schools, and hospitals built under colonialism. He told the Congolese to remember the good that Belgium had done and to continue cooperating with their former rulers. His words were polite but full of arrogance, as if independence was a gift from Belgium, not the result of Congolese struggle. Many Congolese sat silently, listening with anger in their hearts. The day was supposed to be theirs, yet the speech sounded like Belgium was still in control. Kasavubu's response. After Baudouin, President Joseph Kasavubu spoke. His words were calm, restrained, and diplomatic. He thanked Belgium for guiding Congo to independence. He did not challenge Baudouin's version of history. The Belgians smiled. This was the ceremony they had expected: polite words, handshakes, and photographs. Lumumba breaks the silence, but then something unexpected happened. Patrice Lumumba rose from his seat. His speech was not on the program. Belgian officials shifted nervously. Some whispered in alarm. Cameras turned toward him. Lumumba began to speak, his voice steady, his eyes burning with intensity. He did not thank Belgium. He did not praise Leopold. Instead, he spoke directly to his people and to the world. The famous speech, Lumumba declared, "No Congolese will ever forget the crimes committed by the colonizers. We have known ironies, insults, and blows morning, noon, and night because we were Negroes. We have seen our lands seized in the name of so-called laws that were in fact those of the strongest. We have suffered because of our labor, which was paid with nothing but contempt." The room went silent. Belgian officials stiffened in their seats. Lumumba continued, "We are no longer your monkeys. We are no longer your boys. We are free men. We are free in our minds, free in our words, free in our deeds, and we shall never again bow our heads under oppression, humiliation, and injustice." As he spoke, Congolese listeners erupted in applause. For the first time, their prime minister was saying aloud the truth that had been buried for decades. He honored the suffering of those who had been whipped, those who had been killed, those who had been silenced. He told the people that independence was not a gift, it was won by their own courage and sacrifice. He promised a future of equality, dignity, and justice. He vowed that Congo's wealth would serve its people, not foreigners. The reaction. When Lumumba finished, the hall was shaken. Belgians were furious. King Baudouin sat frozen, humiliated in front of the world. Belgian newspapers the next day called Lumumba ungrateful, insolent, and dangerous. But to the Congolese and to Africans everywhere, Lumumba was a hero. His words were electrifying. Across Africa, radios replayed his speech. In Ghana, Guinea, and Algeria, people cheered. Here was a leader who refused to bow, who spoke truth in the very face of power, a marked man, but Lumumba's courage came at a cost. From that day on, Western powers began to see him not as a young prime minister to work with, but as a threat. To Belgium, he was a man who might nationalize their mining companies. To the United States, in the middle of the Cold War, he looked like someone who could lean toward the Soviet Union. To Congolese rivals, his charisma made him dangerous. Independence Day had given Congo freedom, but Lumumba's speech made him enemies who would soon move against him. Narration, Chapter 6. Independence had come with celebration, music, and promise. But within days, the new Congo descended into turmoil. The hopes of millions clashed with the reality of a state that Belgium had left unprepared, and the ambitions of both local rivals and global powers. The army mutiny. The first shock came from the Force Publique, Congo's army. Under colonial rule, the Force Publique had been commanded entirely by Belgian officers. African soldiers, called askaris, had no rank above sergeant. They were treated harshly, often beaten, and paid poorly. When independence arrived, the soldiers expected immediate change. They wanted African officers higher pay and respect. But their Belgian commander, General Janssens, made a disastrous mistake. On a blackboard at Army headquarters, he wrote, "Before independence equal to after independence." His message was clear. Nothing would change for the African soldiers. The reaction was explosive. Soldiers mutinied. They attacked Belgian officers, looted European homes, and spread fear across Leopoldville and other towns. Belgian civilians fled in panic. The mutiny spread rapidly, exposing the fragility of the new state. Lumumba's response. Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba and President Joseph Kasavubu moved quickly. They Africanized the army, promoting Congolese soldiers to officer ranks almost overnight. Joseph Desire Mobutu, then a young sergeant, was promoted to colonel and made chief of staff. This decision calmed some soldiers, but it weakened discipline. Promotions were political, not professional, and Mobutu, ambitious and calculating, now stood in a position of real power. Belgium intervenes. As chaos spread, Belgium used the mutiny as a pretext to intervene militarily. Belgian paratroopers landed in Leopoldville and other cities, claiming to protect European lives. But their presence looked more like a return to colonial control. They seized airports and strategic sites, undermining Congo's sovereignty just days after independence. Lumumba protested fiercely, calling the intervention illegal. He appealed to the world, saying that Congo had not won independence only to be occupied again. Katanga secedes. The crisis deepened on July 11, 1960, when Moise Tshombe, leader of the Konakat Party, declared the secession of Katanga province. Katanga was no ordinary province. It was the economic heart of Congo, home to copper, uranium, cobalt, and other valuable minerals. Belgian mining companies like Union Minière du Haut-Katanga backed Tshombe, eager to maintain control of Katanga's wealth without interference from Lumumba's government. Katanga even hired European mercenaries to train its army. It became a state within a state. For Lumumba, Katanga's secession was a direct threat to Congo's survival. Without Katanga, the new nation would collapse economically. South Kasai breaks away. As if Katanga was not enough, in August 1960, another province followed. Albert Kalonji, leader in South Kasai, declared independence for his region. South Kasai was rich in diamonds, Now, barely a month after independence, Congo was tearing apart. Leopoldville controlled little beyond the capital, while Katanga and South Kasai declared themselves sovereign. The United Nations. Lumumba and Kasavubu turned to the United Nations. They asked Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld to send peacekeepers to restore order and remove Belgian troops. The UN launched ONUC, its largest mission at the time, with soldiers from Ghana, Ethiopia, Tunisia, and other countries. They arrived to applause from Congolese, who saw them as liberators. But Lumumba quickly became frustrated. The UN refused to take direct military action against Katanga. Hammarskjöld argued that ONUC's role was to keep peace, not to fight secessionists. Lumumba saw this as betrayal. He accused the UN of protecting Belgian interests. Turning to the Soviet Union. Desperate, Lumumba made a fateful decision. In September 1960, he turned to the Soviet Union for assistance. The Soviets provided planes to airlift Congolese troops and supplies. It was a tactical move, but in the Cold War climate, it was seen as proof that Lumumba was leaning toward communism. For Washington, London, and Brussels, this was unacceptable. In their eyes, Congo, sitting on some of the world's most strategic minerals, could not fall into Soviet hands. Lumumba, who had declared that Congo's independence was neither east nor west, suddenly found himself branded as a communist pawn. Internal divisions. Inside Congo, politics were unraveling. Kasavubu, the president, clashed with Lumumba, the prime minister. Tshombe in Katanga defied the central government. Kalonji in South Kasai built his own administration. The army, newly Africanized, was unstable under Mobutu's command. Lumumba's fiery charisma was unmatched, but charisma alone could not hold a country together when every institution was collapsing. A nation in free fall. By the end of 1960, Congo was in chaos. Independence had lasted only days before mutiny, secession, and foreign interference tore it apart. Lumumba, once celebrated as the voice of freedom, now stood at the center of a storm that was both Congolese and global. He was fighting not only for Congo's unity, but for control of its destiny, against Belgium, against Cold War superpowers, and against rivals inside his own country. Narration, Chapter 7. The Congo of mid-1960 was like a house built in a storm. The walls were shaking, the roof leaking, and the foundations already cracking. In the middle of it stood Patrice Lumumba, charismatic, determined, but surrounded by rivals, enemies, and foreign plots. Kasavubu versus Lumumba. From the start, the relationship between President Joseph Kasavubu and Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba was uneasy. Kasavubu, leader of Abako, was reserved and cautious, representing the Bakongo people and favoring a federal system of government. Lumumba was fiery and uncompromising, demanding a strong central state that could hold Congo together. The two men were forced into partnership by political necessity, but their visions were incompatible. As Congo unraveled in July and August, their differences grew. Lumumba wanted to send the army against secessionist provinces. Kasavubu feared more bloodshed. Lumumba accused Kasavubu of weakness. Kasavubu accused Lumumba of recklessness. By September, their alliance had collapsed, the dismissal. On September 5th, 1960, Kasavubu made his move. He went on national radio and announced that he had dismissed Lumumba as prime minister. Lumumba was stunned. He argued that under the constitution, only parliament could remove the prime minister, not the president, he refused to accept Kasavubu's decree. The next day, Lumumba went on radio and announced that Kasavubu himself was dismissed. For the Congolese people, it was chaos. They now had two leaders, each claiming the other was illegitimate. Parliament backed Lumumba, but power was shifting away from laws and toward the army. The rise of Mobutu. In this confusion, a young man stepped forward, Colonel Joseph Desire Mobutu. Just 3 months earlier, Mobutu had been an army sergeant. Lumumba himself had promoted him during the Africanization of the army. Now, at only 30 years old, he was commander-in-chief. On September 14, 1960, Mobutu launched what he called a peaceful revolution. Mobutu announced that both Kasavubu and Lumumba were suspended from power. He said politicians were paralyzing the country and that the army would restore order. Parliament was shut down. Lumumba was placed under house arrest in his official residence. Mobutu presented himself as neutral, not against Lumumba, not against Kasavubu, but in reality, he had just staged Congo's first coup d'etat, foreign hands in the coup. Mobutu did not act alone. He had strong support from Western powers. The United States saw Mobutu as reliable, a man they could influence, unlike Lumumba, whom they now considered a communist threat. CIA officers in Leopoldville worked closely with him. Belgium, determined to protect its mining interests, quietly encouraged Mobutu's takeover. Even the United Nations, though officially neutral, did nothing to stop the coup. Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld preferred Mobutu's neutralization of politics to Lumumba's return to power. The so-called peaceful revolution was in truth the moment foreign powers chose their side, and it was not Lumumba's. Lumumba under guard. Though under house arrest, Lumumba refused to be silent. He held press conferences from his veranda, sending letters to supporters across Congo. He still commanded loyalty from many, especially in Stanleyville, where his deputy Antoine Gizenga was rallying Lumumbists. Crowds gathered outside his residence, chanting his name. Soldiers loyal to him protected him at times. He was not just a prisoner. He was still a symbol of legitimacy in the eyes of many Congolese, but his enemies were tightening the net. Western diplomats labeled him a danger. Belgian advisors urged Mobutu to keep him under control. The CIA discussed assassination plots, including poison toothpaste and covert operations. Lumumba's life was now hanging by a thread. A leader surrounded. Lumumba's greatest strength, his charisma, was also his weakness. He could not be ignored. Even in detention, every word he spoke was amplified by his reputation. To his supporters, he was the only leader who dared to say the truth about colonialism. To his rivals, he was a dangerous agitator who could throw Congo into Soviet hands. And to foreign powers, he was simply unacceptable, a nationalist they could not control in a country whose minerals were too important to lose. Narration, Chapter 8. By late 1960, Patrice Lumumba's situation had become desperate. He was dismissed as prime minister by Kasavubu, sidelined by Mobutu's coup, and abandoned by the United Nations. Yet he still held the loyalty of many Congolese, especially in Stanleyville, in the east, where his ally, Antoine Gizenga, was preparing a government in his name. Lumumba believed that if he could reach Stanleyville, he could rally his supporters, rebuild his authority, and continue the struggle for a united Congo. It was a dangerous gamble, but he was not a man to sit quietly while his country fell apart. The escape. On November 27, 1960, Lumumba slipped out of his residence in Leopoldville, where he had been under house arrest. With him were his wife Pauline, his infant son, and a small group of loyal supporters. They traveled in a convoy of cars heading north and east along the Congo River. Their destination, Stanleyville, hundreds of kilometers away, through forests, rivers, and towns patrolled by soldiers loyal to Mobutu. The journey was perilous. Along the way, villagers greeted Lumumba with joy. To them, he was still the true leader of Congo, the man who had spoken truth on Independence Day. They offered him food, shelter, and encouragement. But Mobutu's troops were closing in. Radio messages warned of his escape. Roadblocks appeared. The noose was tightening the capture at the Sankuru River. On December 1st, 1960, near the Sankuru River, Lumumba's convoy was intercepted. He was seized by soldiers loyal to Mobutu. Eyewitnesses recalled the brutality of the capture. Lumumba was beaten, tied, and mocked. His wife and child were separated from him. Soldiers cheered, pulling his hair and dragging him through the dirt. He was brought back to Leopoldville, humiliated before the cameras. The man who had stood tall before King Baudouin now appeared in torn clothes, tied up, surrounded by enemies. Yet even in defeat, Lumumba's spirit shone. Witnesses said he held his head high, refusing to beg, refusing to show fear. Imprisonment. For the next weeks, Lumumba was shuttled between prisons, first in Thaisville, then elsewhere, always under guard, always in danger. His supporters in Stanleyville declared him the legitimate prime minister and rallied around Antoine Gizenga. They demanded his release. Protests spread, but Mobutu and Kasavubu were determined to silence him. Foreign powers added pressure. The United States, Belgium, and others feared that as long as Lumumba was alive, he could return to power or inspire rebellion. Assassination plots circulated in CIA cables. Belgium's leaders privately called for his definitive elimination. The United Nations, meanwhile, stood aside. Dag Hammarskjöld insisted ONU could not intervene in Congo's internal affairs. For Lumumba, the organization he had once turned to for help had become a wall of silence. The transfer to Katanga. In January 1961, a final decision was made. Lumumba would be sent to Katanga, the secessionist province under Moise Tshombe, where Belgian officers and mercenaries held sway. It was effectively a death sentence. Katanga was enemy territory. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba was flown there with two of his closest allies, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okito. The last hours. That night, in a remote house in Katanga, the three men were beaten and tortured. Belgian officers and Katangan officials were present. Lumumba's body was bruised, but his dignity unbroken. Finally, they were driven to a clearing. In the darkness, they were lined up before a firing squad. Shots rang out. Patrice Lumumba, Maurice Mpolo, and Joseph Okito fell to the ground. They were hastily buried, then exhumed the next day. To erase the evidence, Belgian officers ordered their bodies dissolved in acid, their bones crushed, their remains scattered. The goal was to ensure there would be no grave, no shrine, no place where Congolese could mourn their fallen leader. But memory cannot be dissolved in acid. The world reacts. News of Lumumba's death spread slowly, then exploded across the globe. In Africa, outrage was immediate. In Ghana, Nkrumah declared days of mourning. In Guinea, Sékou Touré denounced the murder as a crime against Africa. Across the continent, Lumumba became a martyr of independence. In Europe and America, officials spoke cautiously, hiding their involvement. But documents later revealed the truth. Belgium had organized his transfer, and the CIA had actively plotted his elimination, the symbol of resistance. Patrice Lumumba was only 35 years old when he died. His time in power had lasted barely 3 months, yet his death transformed him from a political leader into a symbol of courage, of dignity, of resistance against neo-colonialism. His final words, written in a letter to his wife Pauline from prison, still echo, "History will have its say. It will not be the history taught in Brussels, Paris, Washington, or the United Nations, but the history taught in the countries that have freed themselves from colonialism and its puppets. Africa will write its own history, and it will be a history of glory and dignity." And indeed, history has spoken in narration. Chapter 9. On the night of January 17, 1961, Patrice Lumumba, Maurice Mupolo, and Joseph Okito were executed in Katanga. Their bodies were destroyed in secret, their remains erased. The men who carried out the killing, Katangan authorities, Belgian officers, and European mercenaries, believed they had buried not only Lumumba's body, but also his spirit. They were wrong. The secrecy of the assassination, immediately after the executions, officials in Katanga and Brussels agreed to conceal the truth. Moise Tshombé's secessionist government claimed Lumumba had been transferred safely. Belgian officers reported that he was well guarded, but within days rumors began to spread. Too many soldiers had seen the beatings, too many whispers carried the story. To confuse the world, Katangan authorities announced that Lumumba had escaped custody. Then they claimed he had been attacked by villagers. Their statements contradicted each other. The cover-up was clumsy, but the killers counted on international silence. The Belgian role. Decades later, evidence revealed the depth of Belgium's involvement. Belgian ministers had sent messages urging Lumumba's elimination. Belgian officers were present during his torture and execution. One officer later admitted to personally helping dissolve Lumumba's body in acid, keeping 2 teeth as souvenirs. For years, Belgium denied responsibility. Only in 2002, after an official parliamentary inquiry, did the Belgian government formally apologize for its moral responsibility in Lumumba's death. But in 1961, the truth was hidden. The CIA and the Cold War. The United States also played a role. The CIA had marked Lumumba as a communist threat. President Dwight Eisenhower, in a National Security Council meeting, allegedly gave orders for his removal. CIA Director Alan Dulles described Lumumba as a danger to the free world and authorized assassination plots, including poison. While the CIA's direct involvement in the final execution remains debated, documents prove that they encouraged and supported efforts to neutralize him. For Washington, Lumumba's willingness to accept Soviet assistance made him unacceptable. Better, they believed, a Congo ruled by Mobutu or Chom than one led by a nationalist they could not control. The United Nations' silence. Perhaps the most painful betrayal came from the United Nations. Lumumba had turned to the UN for help against Belgian troops and Katanga secession. But Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld insisted the UN could not interfere in Congo's internal affairs. When Lumumba was arrested, the UN refused to intervene. When he was killed, they expressed regret, but did not confront Belgium or Mobutu directly. To many Africans, this proved that the UN, like the Western powers, had failed to protect true independence. The global reaction. When Lumumba's death was finally confirmed in February 1961, the world erupted. In Africa, outrage was fierce. Ghana declared days of mourning. Guinea named streets after Lumumba. In Cairo, students marched in protest. In Algeria, still fighting for independence, his death was seen as proof of colonial cruelty. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, Lumumba was hailed as a martyr of anti-imperialism. Moscow named universities and squares after him. In the West, governments tried to downplay the event, but ordinary people protested. Writers, activists, and students across Europe condemned the murder. Lumumba's face appeared on posters, his name on banners, his story told in speeches and songs. He became a symbol not only for Congo but for the whole African liberation struggle. Congo after Lumumba. With Lumumba gone, Congo's crisis deepened. Antoine Gizenga declared a rival government in Stanleyville, claiming to continue Lumumba's legacy. Katanga remained secessionist, backed by Belgian companies and mercenaries. Mobutu consolidated his influence in Leopoldville, quietly building the foundations of his long dictatorship. The dream of a united sovereign Congo was slipping away, even as Lumumba's spirit inspired resistance. The making of a martyr. The men who killed Lumumba believed they had silenced him forever, but instead they created a martyr. Lumumba's death transformed him into something larger than life. He was no longer just the young prime minister of a fragile country. He was the voice of Africa betrayed by colonial powers, the symbol of dignity cut down before its time. His letter from prison to his wife Pauline spread like fire across the world, its words immortal. The day will come when history will speak, but it will not be the history taught in Brussels, Paris, Washington, or the United Nations. It will be the history taught in the countries that have freed themselves from colonialism and its puppets. Africa will write its own history, and it will be a history of glory and dignity. History did speak, and it placed Lumumba alongside the giants of liberation, Nkrumah, Nyerere, Mandela, Cabral. Narration, Chapter 10. When Patrice Lumumba was murdered in January 1961, he was just 35 years old. His time in power had lasted barely 3 months. His government was short, chaotic, and torn apart by forces far larger than one man could control. And yet, his name did not vanish into the silence his killers tried to create. Instead, it grew louder. Lumumba in Congo. In his homeland, Lumumba became a myth and a memory. For decades, Congolese people whispered his name with reverence. Even under Mobutu, who built a dictatorship lasting more than 30 years, Lumumba's ghost haunted the nation. Mobutu at first denounced Lumumba, calling him reckless. But later, realizing Lumumba's enduring popularity, Mobutu tried to claim him as a national hero. Streets, monuments, and schools bore Lumumba's name, even as Mobutu betrayed the principles Lumumba had died for. Today, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Lumumba is honored as a founding father. His speeches are studied, his face appears on banknotes, his story told in schools. In 2022, Belgium finally returned one of Lumumba's teeth, the only surviving part of his body, to his family, a small but powerful act of symbolic justice. Lumumba in Africa. Across Africa, Lumumba's name is spoken with the same reverence as Nkrumah, Mandela, Cabral, and Nyerere. He is remembered as the man who dared to tell the truth about colonialism, not with polite words, but with fire and dignity. For revolutionaries, he became proof that the struggle was dangerous but necessary. His image appeared in murals from Algiers to Maputo. His speeches were quoted in South Africa, Angola, and Mozambique. For Pan-Africanists, he was a symbol of unity. He had refused to divide Congo along tribal lines, insisting that independence must be for all Congolese. His vision echoed the dreams of leaders like Nkrumah, who wanted Africa to stand as one. Lumumba in the world. Beyond Africa, Lumumba's story resonated worldwide. In the Soviet Union and across the socialist world, he was celebrated as a martyr of anti-imperialism. Moscow named the Patrice Lumumba University after him, where thousands of African students studied. In the United States, civil rights leaders invoked his name as they fought against racism and imperialism. In Latin America, revolutionaries like Che Guevara admired him as a brother in the struggle against Western domination. Lumumba's words, recorded on crackling radios, crossed oceans and inspired the oppressed wherever they listened. The lessons of Lumumba. What then does Lumumba's life teach us? It teaches that independence is not just the lowering of one flag and the raising of another. It is the daily fight for dignity, for control over a nation's resources, for unity among its people. It teaches that courage has a cost. Lumumba spoke truth to power, even on Independence Day before the Belgian king. That courage inspired millions, but it also painted a target on his back. It teaches that Africa's struggle did not end with independence. The hand of colonialism simply changed its gloves. Neo-colonialism, through companies, foreign powers, and puppet leaders, became the new battlefield. And it teaches us the power of words. Lumumba did not command great armies, nor did he rule long. But his voice, sharp and fearless, still echoes more than 60 years after his death. A legacy of dignity. In the end, Lumumba's true victory was not in office but in memory. His killers dissolved his body in acid, but they could not dissolve his ideas. They scattered his remains, but they could not scatter his legacy. Today, young Africans look to Lumumba as a reminder that the struggle for dignity is never over. His life reminds us that Africa's leaders must serve their people, not foreign masters, must protect their nation's wealth, not sell it, must honor unity, not division. Closing reflection. Patrice Emery Lumumba was not perfect. He was young, sometimes impulsive, sometimes unprepared for the enormity of the task before him. But he was genuine, he was fearless, he loved his country and he died for it. And as he himself wrote in his final letter to Pauline, history will have its say, Africa will write its own history, and it will be a history of glory and dignity. That history is still being written today, in Congo, in Africa, and in every struggle where people fight to be free. Thank you for listening to Patrice Lumumba, The Voice of Congo, produced by Bantu Studio and read by me, Mugisha. If you believe in African history, if you believe we must tell our own stories, subscribe to Bantu Studio on YouTube. This is not the end. More stories of Africa's leaders are coming. Stories to remember, stories to teach, stories to inspire. Because Africa must never forget.